In the city of Baghdad, during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, a fisherman pulled a locked chest from the river and found a horror inside: a dead woman cut into pieces. A mystery that would take the Caliph, his Vizier, and a chain of confessions to unravel. And at the center of it all, 3 apples that held the key to everything. Close your eyes and let the ancient streets of Baghdad carry you back to a time when a single piece of fruit could destroy a family. Chapter 1. The Chest in the River. The fisherman cast his net into the Tigris River at dawn, just as he had done every morning for 30 years. The river was wide and slow and brown, carrying the city's secrets with it. He pulled his net in slowly, feeling the familiar weight of the wet rope in his calloused hands. But this morning the net was heavier than usual, much heavier. He thought his luck had finally turned. He pulled harder, his bare feet slipping in the mud, and hauled the net onto the bank. What he found inside was not a fish. It was a wooden chest, bound with iron bands and locked with a strong padlock. Water dripped from every seam. The fisherman's heart pounded. Chests in the river meant treasure. Rich men threw their valuables into the water during times of war, hoping to retrieve them later. He found a rock and broke the lock. He lifted the lid and he screamed. Inside the chest was the body of a young woman. She had been cut into pieces and packed inside with a speed that spoke of rage and efficiency. Her face was still recognizable. She had been beautiful once. Her dark hair was spread around her head like a halo, and her eyes were closed as if she was sleeping. But the rest of her told a different story. The fisherman stumbled backward and fell into the mud. He sat there for a long time, staring at the chest, not knowing what to do. Every instinct told him to push the chest back into the river and pretend he had never seen it. Men who found bodies were often accused of the murders themselves, but he knew he could not. The body had been placed in the river to be found. Someone wanted her discovered, and if he hid the evidence, he would be complicit in the crime. He covered the chest with his cloak, carried it through the waking streets of Baghdad, and left it at the gate of the Caliph's palace. He ran before anyone could stop him. The guards found the chest. They opened it, and by the time the sun had fully risen, the Caliph himself knew what lay inside. Chapter 2. The Caliph's Ultimatum. Caliph Harun al-Rashid was not a man who tolerated disorder. His city was supposed to be the jewel of the world, the center of learning and culture and justice. The discovery of a murdered woman in his own river, cut into pieces and locked in a chest, was a stain on his rule that he could not ignore. It was an insult, a challenge, and he would not let it stand. He summoned his Vizier, a man named Jafar the Barmecide, who had served him faithfully for many years. Jafar was wise, careful, and known throughout the kingdom for his calm judgment. The Caliph looked at him with cold, hard eyes and gave him an order. 3 days. You have 3 days to find the murderer and bring him to justice. If you fail, I will have you hanged in his place. Jafar felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He bowed deeply and left the throne room, his mind racing. He had no witnesses, no suspects, no clues except a locked chest and a dead woman he had never seen before. He sent men to every corner of Baghdad. They questioned merchants and sailors, beggars and scholars. They searched warehouses and docks and the narrow alleyways of the poorest quarters. They found nothing. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody knew anything. The first day passed in a blur of dead ends. The second day brought nothing but frustration. On the morning of the third day, Ja'far sat in his study with his head in his hands and accepted the truth. He had failed. He called for his wife and children and said goodbye to them with a calmness he did not feel. He wrote his final letters. He prepared his soul for judgment. He was going to die for a crime he did not commit, killed by the very man he had served his entire life. Chapter 3. The Last Day. On the morning of the third day, Ja'far sat alone in his courtyard, watching the sun climb over the walls of his house. The guards would come for him soon. He had made peace with his fate. He had kissed his wife and held his children one last time. He had written letters to his brothers, explaining what had happened and asking them to care for his family. There was nothing left to do but wait. And then, just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the gates of his house burst open. Two men stumbled into the courtyard, both talking at once, both desperate. One was old, with white hair and a bent back. The other was young, with the hollow eyes of a man who had not slept in 3 days. Both of them were shouting the same words. "I am the murderer. Arrest me. I am the one you are looking for." Ja'far stared at them, unable to speak. He had spent 3 days searching for a single killer across the entire city of Baghdad, and now 2 men were fighting over the privilege of being executed. He separated them and demanded an explanation. The young man stepped forward first. He was tall and handsome, but his clothes were torn and his hands were stained with something dark. He spoke with a voice that cracked and broke. "I killed my wife," he said. "The woman in the chest was my wife. I loved her more than anything in this world, and I killed her with my own hands. I deserve to die. Take me to the Caliph and let me pay for what I have done." The old man grabbed Ja'far's sleeve with trembling fingers. "Do not listen to him," he said. "I killed my daughter. I am the one who should hang. The boy is lying to protect me because he thinks my old life is worth less than his young one. But I am guilty, not him." Ja'far looked from one face to the other. Both men were telling the truth as they believed it, but neither could be telling the whole truth. He ordered his guards to bring both of them before the Caliph. Chapter 4. The Young Man's Confession. Caliph al-Rashid sat on his throne and listened as the young man told his story. The young man spoke with a voice that cracked and broke in all the wrong places. He looked like a man who had already died and was only waiting for his body to realize it. He had married the woman in the chest 3 years ago. He had loved her completely, the way a drowning man loves air. She was kind and gentle, and she had given him a son. They had been happy, happier than he had ever been in his life, and then she fell ill. The illness was not serious, but it lingered. She grew pale and weak and listless. One afternoon, she told him that she had a strange and specific craving. She wanted an apple, not just any apple. She wanted one of the rare apples that grew only in the Caliph's private orchards in Basra. These apples were famous throughout the kingdom. They were large and red and impossibly sweet. They could not be found anywhere else in the world. The young man could not bear to see his wife suffer. He kissed her forehead, packed a small bag of dried food, and set out for Basra that same day. He walked for 3 days without stopping, sleeping in roadside ditches when his legs gave out. When he finally reached the Caliph's orchard, he begged the gardeners for a single apple. They were moved by his story and gave him 3. He carried them home as if they were made of solid gold, wrapping them in cloth to protect them from the sun. His wife's face lit up when she saw the apples. She ate one immediately and said it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. For a few days the household was filled with joy. The young man thought his love and his sacrifice had saved her. Chapter 5. The Three Apples. For a few days after the young man returned from Basra, everything was fine. His wife recovered her strength. She smiled again. She played with their son in the courtyard. The young man believed his long journey and his sacrifice had brought her back to health. But then he saw the slave boy. It was late afternoon in the crowded market. The young man was walking home when he passed a slave boy standing near a fruit stall. The boy was young, about 12 years old, with dark skin and a striped tunic, and he was holding a large red apple. The young man stopped walking. He recognized that apple. It was the same rare kind he had traveled 3 days to find. There was no mistaking it. He grabbed the slave boy by the arm and demanded to know where he had gotten it. The slave boy was frightened, but he tried to sound important. He grinned and said, "My lover gave it to me. She is beautiful and kind, and she lives in a fine house near the river." The young man's blood turned to ice. The slave boy kept talking, describing the woman, her neighborhood, the house with the blue door. Every detail matched. The young man let the slave boy go and walked home with a darkness growing in his chest, like a tumor. He went straight to the table where he had left the remaining 2 apples. There was only one. He searched the house. He questioned the servants. Nobody knew where the second apple had gone. He sat down and let the poison of suspicion do its work. The rational part of his brain knew there could be an explanation. His wife could have eaten it. A servant could have taken it. He could be mistaken about the number. But the jealous part of his brain, the part that had been whispering to him for hours, was louder. He confronted his wife. She said she had eaten the apple. He did not believe her. Chapter 6. The Rash Act. The confrontation began quietly. The young man asked his wife where the second apple was. She said she had eaten it that morning. He asked her again, his voice rising. She insisted. Her eyes were wide and confused. She did not understand why he was so angry. He told her about the slave boy, the apple, the claims of a lover. She laughed. She thought it was a ridiculous mistake. She tried to take his hand. He pulled away. The jealousy had taken root too deeply. It had become a story he believed with his whole heart, and no amount of reason could change it. He lost control. He had never raised a hand to her in 3 years of marriage, but this was different. The fire in his chest burned away every reasonable thought. He grabbed her by the shoulders. He demanded the truth. She cried and swore on her mother's grave that she had never been unfaithful. He did not listen. In a single terrible moment, blinded by rage and imagined betrayal, he took her life. He stood over her body, gasping, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him. He had killed the woman he loved most in the world. He had killed the mother of his son. He had destroyed everything. He sat beside her for hours, not moving, not thinking, just staring at her face, waiting for her to open her eyes and tell him it was a dream. When he finally moved, it was with the mechanical precision of a man in shock. He found a chest in the storage room. He packed her body inside. He carried it through the dark streets, to the river, threw it into the water, and watched it sink. Then he went home, sat down in the corner, and waited for justice to find him. Chapter 7. The Old Man's Lie. When the young man finished his confession, the Caliph's court was absolutely silent. The guards stood frozen. The clerks had stopped writing. Even the Caliph seemed uncertain, his hard expression softened by the raw grief in the young man's voice. A long moment passed before anyone spoke. Then the old man stepped forward. He was the young man's father-in-law, the father of the dead woman. His face was grey and his hands trembled, but his voice was steady as stone. "My lord," he said, "the young man is lying. He did not kill my daughter. I did. I killed her because she had disgraced our family. I cut her body and placed her in the chest. I threw her into the river. I am the one who deserves to die. I am the murderer." The court erupted in murmurs. Two men confessing to the same murder, both swearing on their immortal souls that they were guilty. The Caliph's Vizier, Jafar, stepped forward and asked the old man to describe the crime. The old man gave a description that matched the young man's in every particular detail. The chest, the location on the river, even the way the body had been cut. But the young man shook his head. "He is lying to save me," he said. "He is old and he thinks his death matters less than mine. But I committed the crime. I am the one who should hang. Please, my lord, do not let an innocent man die for me." The Caliph looked at Jafar with frustration. Two confessions, one crime. The Vizier had to find out which one was true, and he had only one more day to do it. Jafar bowed and left the court, his mind working furiously. One of these men was lying to protect the other. The truth was hiding somewhere in their stories, and he had to find it before the sun set again. Chapter 8. The Vizier's Investigation. Jafar left the palace and walked through the crowded streets of Baghdad with his head down, thinking. Two men had confessed to the same murder. Their stories matched in every key detail. One of them was clearly protecting the other, but which one and for what reason? He began by questioning the young man alone in a small room away from the court. The young man repeated his story without wavering. He described the slave boy in vivid detail, his round face, his striped tunic, the exact corner of the market where he had been standing. He described the apple and the way the boy had grinned when he said the word lover. These were not details a guilty man would invent. They were memories, sharp and painful. Then he questioned the old man alone. The old man's story was different. It was less detailed, more vague. He could not describe the slave boy. He did not know about the apples. He kept repeating the same words, "I killed her." When Jafar pressed him on exactly how and when he had done it, the old man's answers grew hesitant. He looked away. He rubbed his hands together. Finally, under patient questioning, the old man broke down and told the truth. He had not been at the house when his daughter died. He had arrived the next morning and found the young man sitting beside her body, weeping. The young man had confessed to him immediately. The old man's first instinct was to turn him in. But then he thought about his grandson, who would grow up without a father. He thought about the young man's grief, which was so deep and genuine that it could not be faked. He decided to confess in his place. The young man was the real killer. He was guilty, and his guilt was now beyond question. Chapter 9. The Search for the Slave. The young man's guilt was established, but Jafar could not let the matter rest. The slave boy existed. The apple existed. And if the slave boy had lied about where he got the apple, then the young man's wife had been completely innocent. She had not been unfaithful. She had simply been unlucky, and the young man had killed her for nothing. Jafar went back to the young man and pressed him for every last detail about the slave boy. About 12 years old, dark skin, wearing a worn, striped tunic, standing near the fruit seller's stall in the eastern market, holding a large red apple, laughing when he said the word lover. Jafar sent his most trusted officers through the city. They searched every market and every alley. They questioned every slave dealer and every fruit seller. They asked every family in the eastern district if they owned a slave boy matching the description. Hours passed. The sun began to sink toward the horizon. The officers returned one by one, empty-handed. The slave boy had vanished into the crowded warrens of the city. Jafar sat in his study as the candles were lit and tried to think of another approach. His officers had searched thoroughly. The boy was either well hidden or had been moved. He changed tactics. He sent his men to search every house in the street where the young man lived, one by one, family by family. They were to ask about any slave boys who had recently acquired something unusual, a piece of fruit, a new piece of clothing, anything that seemed out of place. The night grew deeper. Jafar waited, and just before midnight a knock came at his door. His officer had found the slave. Chapter 10. The Slave's Confession. The slave boy was brought before Jafar. He was young, no more than 12 years old, with a round face and wide eyes full of tears. He was trembling so hard that his teeth chattered. He had been sold to a merchant's family 6 months ago, and had been living in a house just 2 streets away from the young man and his wife. Under patient questioning, the boy broke down and told the truth. He had been walking past the young man's house one afternoon, and had seen 3 beautiful apples sitting on the window-sill of the kitchen. He had never seen apples like them before. They were large and red and perfect, glowing in the afternoon light. He had reached through the open window and taken one. Just one. He thought nobody would notice. He ate the apple on his way home, savoring every bite. When another servant boy asked him where he had gotten such a fine piece of fruit, he had lied. He said his lover had given it to him. He wanted to sound important. He wanted the other boy to be impressed. He had no idea that his lie would lead to a woman's death. Jafar sat back in his chair and stared at the boy for a long moment. A child's lie. A moment of petty theft and childish boasting. That was what had started everything. A husband consumed by jealousy, a stolen apple, and a slave boy who wanted to impress his friends with a story that was not true. The young man's wife had been innocent. She had never betrayed him. She had simply been unlucky enough to leave her fruit on the wrong windowsill at the wrong time. The tragedy was complete, and Jafar now had to tell the Caliph. Chapter 11. The Caliph's Judgment. Jafar brought the slave boy before the Caliph and told him the full story. He spoke without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. The young man's jealous rage, the old man's sacrificial lie, the slave boy's theft, and the careless words that had set everything in motion. The wife's complete innocence, the full weight of the tragedy laid bare for the court to see. The Caliph listened in absolute silence. When Jafar finished, he sat motionless on his throne for a long time, his face unreadable. The court held its breath. Guards stood frozen. Even the birds in the courtyard seemed to stop their singing. Finally, the Caliph spoke. He said, "The young man killed his wife. He did it with his own hands. By the letter of the law, he should die. But the law also recognizes that a man who kills in a fit of passion, believing himself wronged, is not the same as a man who kills in cold blood. His crime was born of love, twisted into madness by a lie. He believed He was avenging his honor. He was wrong, but his belief was real. The Caliph looked directly at the young man who stood with his head bowed and tears streaming down his face. "You will not die by the sword," the Caliph said. "Your punishment is to live with what you have done. Every morning for the rest of your life, you will wake up knowing that you killed an innocent woman because you believed a slave boy's lie. That is a heavier sentence than any execution I could order." The young man fell to his knees and wept into his hands. The Caliph turned to the slave boy. "You will be freed from your master," he said. "You will be sent to a family who will educate you, and you will never forget that words have power. Your careless boast cost a woman her life. Let that knowledge sit with you forever." Chapter 12. The Weight of an Apple. The court was dismissed. The young man walked home through streets he no longer recognized, a shadow of the man he had been a week ago. He would raise his son alone, in a house haunted by the ghost of a woman he had killed with his own hands. He would explain to the boy one day why his mother was not coming back, and he would spend the rest of his life wondering if he could ever be forgiven. The slave boy was taken to a new home where he would be educated and trained in a trade. He would grow up knowing that his words had destroyed a family. The old man went back to his empty house, having lost his daughter and nearly lost his son-in-law to the gallows. His lie had been one of love, but it had almost cost him everything. Jafar walked home through the dark streets of Baghdad, exhausted but alive. He had come within hours of being executed for a crime he did not commit. A last-minute confession had saved him. A slave boy's careless lie had nearly destroyed a dozen lives. He sat in his courtyard as the stars came out and thought about the weight of a single apple. One piece of fruit stolen by a hungry boy. One lie told by a child who wanted to impress his friend. One moment of rage felt by a husband who loved too deeply. A woman was dead. A family was shattered. A vizier had nearly been hanged. And all of it had started with an apple sitting on a windowsill waiting to be taken. The Caliph had been right. The young man's punishment was worse than death. He would live every single day knowing what he had done, and Jafar, who had nearly died for this crime, would carry the story with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that the smallest actions can have the largest consequences, and that a single apple in the wrong hands can destroy everything a person loves. The end.